Hi, I'm Mike Mercer. I'd like to welcome you to Empower You. Tonight's discussion will be with Dr. Chris Fuhrmann. She's a professor of music, history, and literature at Baldwin Wallace University, which is outside of Cleveland. And the title of her talk tonight is "What Makes Bach's Music So Great?" So this talk is basically designed to show people, why Bach is considered such a great classical composer. And the talk's designed to be accessible to everybody, regardless of their musical background. And she will be including musical examples that she'll be playing throughout the talk. So, as I mentioned, Chris is at Baldwin Wallace University, and she's the chair of the academic studies department, and she's the professor of music history and literature, and she's the Bach editor of the Journal of the Riemann Schneider Bach Institute. And she had previously taught at Oberlin College's Conservatory of Music and at Ashland University. She was also the managing editor of the Journal of Musicology, and she's been published a lot. And I want to mention she actually has a book that sounds great. It's called Foreign Opera at the London Playhouses from Mozart to Bellini. And she has her BA from Marlborough College and a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. So I'd like to welcome you, Chris.
Thank you so much. And tonight's talk is about Johann Sebastian Bach. So I hope it will be lightening everybody's mood from thinking about fracking and AI to thinking about Bach. And so I'm going to go ahead and share
Let
my,
me
oops,
Let me
I'm
just
sorry.
mention to the audience about questions. So, she'll be taking questions at the end. You can submit your questions at any time and we'll hold them. I'll monitor the questions. And if there's anything that seems urgent that we should answer in the moment, I'll alert Chris, but we're going to try to hold the questions to the end. So that's it.
All right. So I'm sharing my screen and starting my slideshow. Can everybody see that okay? All
Yep.
right. So Bach. I'm sure you've heard of him and you've probably heard his music, even if you don't think that you have, because it's kind of everywhere, whether you turn to film or commercials or just listening to the radio, his music is everywhere. And the question for tonight is why? Why do we all know Bach? I mean, he died in 1750. Why do we still know him? Now, I don't think that anybody, including myself, can really answer that question definitively. But I think it comes down to the fact that Bach really appeals to so many listeners. He has works that are very intimate, just for a solo cello or a solo keyboard. He has grand works for huge choruses. He has complicated works like the fugue. He has simple works like those simple keyboard pieces that many of us probably played when we were taking piano lessons. He has works for every mood and every moment in our lives. And in this lecture, I'm going to attempt to come a bit closer to understanding why Bach has been so alluring by looking at his breadth of expression in music for both the worldly or secular sphere and then the heavenly or sacred sphere. Now, today, we like to think about composers writing just because they feel like it, the inspiration strikes them. But in Bach's day, a composer was more like a craftsman, somebody who was fulfilling a very specific practical need in society and fulfilling it with excellence and pride. And much of Bach's music was therefore shaped by whatever job he had at the time. And today we're going to look at a few representative works from the three big periods of his life. First, as an organist, then as a court musician, and then in his main job as the director of church music, which he held for the last 25 years or so of his life. And we're going to begin, as Bach did, with the organ. And Bach was apparently an unbelievable organist. And here I have quotations from all sorts of different time periods. His obituary said he was the greatest organist that we have ever had. Johann Adolf Scheibe, who actually famously criticized Bach, did praise his organ playing, that he can use his fingers and his feet. And Bach himself was very modest. He said, you just have to hit the right keys at the right time. And I think any of us who have tried to play an instrument know that it is a lot more complicated than that. So we're going to start with the piece that I think most people know the most, even if they don't know that it's by Bach, or even if they don't know Bach, and that is the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. And this was composed sometime before 1708. So this is his earliest period when he was an organist primarily. Now, some have questioned its authorship, and that's kind of gone back and forth. Was it by Bach or was it not by Bach? But the current consensus seems to be that it probably was by him. So we're going to go ahead and listen to this piece. And we're going to listen to the toccata, which meant a free piece for instruments, usually for keyboard instruments. And it was kind of almost improvisatory. Bach did write down the notes, but he probably improvised it or made it up on the spot as he was writing it. And it sounds kind of like it is made up on the spot. And Bach, like all of his contemporaries, was a performer. He was a composer. You really couldn't be just one or just the other. And he was an improviser. So I think this toccata kind of captures what it would have been like to hear him play and to hear him improvise. So we're going to watch a little video. I think it's helpful to see the organ being played. Certainly in Bach's day, most people would actually see the music being played rather than just hearing it. And so we're going to watch Hans Andreas Stamm playing this on an organ in Waltershausen, Germany. This is an organ that was from Bach's time, and Bach probably played on it. So it's therefore considered an important organ for capturing what the sound might have been like at the time. So as we listen, I'm going to be thinking about, and you can think about, why do we still love this music so much today? Like, why are we using it in most films? You often hear this and in commercials. Why is it so captivating? And I'll talk about that a little bit, and then I'll hope at the end that you'll be thinking as we go through this presentation, what is it that's appealing to you, and why maybe is Bach great in your personal opinion? So let's go ahead and listen. right. So I hope that you enjoyed that and you may have recognized that piece, hopefully. Many of you may have heard that. And I think it's great to watch that being performed. So you may have thought of many reasons why you love that piece, and I'll be excited to hear that toward the end of our talk. Here are a few things that I personally love about it. One is the virtuosity, just how incredibly difficult it is to play. And one of the reasons I wanted to show you a video of it being played is to emphasize that all the fingers going on the different keyboards and then the feet playing alone. This is something that is extremely difficult. And I think we're always wowed by virtuosity. It kind of shows us feats that seem unachievable by normal humans such as us. And I think that's always exciting. It's also something that is clearly written by somebody who knows the organ as an instrument. And if any of you have ever played an instrument or have done some singing, you know that there are some pieces that are just written really, really well for the voice or for your instrument. And they're very gratifying to play because they just sound so good and take advantage of the instrument. And I have to say that organ music is sort of iffy for me. Sometimes I go and hear organs and it just sounds like a huge blast of sound. It's kind of hard to distinguish. But I was at a conference one time where I heard Bach played live on an organ, and I just felt instantly here is why people love his organ music. He really understood how to approach that and the feeling of all that sound kind of washing over you. If you ever get a chance to hear Bach played live on an organ, definitely go. It also shows that Bach really understood the idea of harmony. And this is a technical term, but what it ultimately means is that if we, for example, sing Happy Birthday in harmony, what we're doing is we're taking the Happy Birthday melody and we're singing another note at the same time as the Happy Birthday melody, and it sounds good together. And with harmony, you're kind of taking these sounds that sound together and you're creating a sense of tension and then release. And Bach is very, very good at that. This is when we start to use that harmonic system that we really know today. And Bach really understands how to get us the drama of that harmony. And here is a quotation from one of Bach's students that if ever a musician employed the most hidden secrets of harmony, it was certainly our Bach. Now, I want to just pause here for a moment. I'm seeing a couple things come in on the chat. If I'm supposed to be answering those now, let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to wait till the end.
No, we're fine.
Okay, great. Um, so, um, so let me go back a little bit and just show you a little bit of that idea of sort of the tension and release of the harmony. Let me see if I can go back to the beginning. Oh, it doesn't like me. Let's try to get back there. So we had sort of tension, 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 and release. Release. So hopefully that gives you kind of a sense of where you feel a little bit unstable, like you wouldn't be happy if we paused there, and then when you feel a bit more stable. Now, although that particular piece for organ was one of our worldly pieces, it wasn't necessarily written for the church, it's just written for the organ. Bach typically wrote church music that was typically wrote organ music rather that was for the church. Bach himself was a devout Lutheran, and Lutheran church services were something that he played music for and composed music for his entire life. And Lutheran church services, as you may know if you are Lutheran, were centered musically on something called a chorale. And the chorale was essentially like a hymn that the congregation would sing together. And if you ever sing together with your congregation in your place of worship, you know that these hymns or chorales are very appealing to the congregation to sing together. Now, what Bach's job would be he would take this simple melody and he would accompany it, and he would add some harmonies underneath it to make it more interesting. And we're going to listen to a chorale. So this is a hymn sung by the congregation in German. And as a church organist, Bach would have accompanied these, and then he often would have played like a chorale prelude based on the chorale or reflecting on its text before people sang the chorale itself. And in general, he would use these tunes as the basis for a lot of his compositions. So let's look now at his completely focused on church music works, and this is one of them. And this is Durch Adam's Fall, or Through Adam's Fall. And so this is a chorale that is reflecting on this idea of Adam's fall and the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So it's something that is rather reflective and rather sober. And I'm going to go ahead and play you the piece, and we're again going to see the organ being played here. And what you'll hear is kind of on the top of the texture, the higher line, is going to be your fairly simple chorale tune. And then you're going to have Bach kind of accompanying that underneath, and see if you can hear that kind of difference between the simple chorale and then his accompaniment. And you probably heard that tension and then release right at the end. And hopefully you noticed that kind of the top part of the organist's right hand was playing some longer, slower notes, and then the rest of his hands and his feet were kind of going crazy down there. So that is sort of the chorale tune plus Bach's accompaniment. And why do we love this? You may have your own opinions, obviously. What I really love is the creativity. This is a relatively simple tune, but all of the kind of machinations and other melodies and harmonies that Bach is putting under it, I really marvel at that creativity, and I appreciate that he can draw on that depth and seriousness when the subject requires it. And I also love the harmonic complexity, right? He's having this really simple chorale tune, but then he's sort of adding all of these additional pieces under it. Now, interestingly, his employers at some of his first jobs where he came in and he was supposed to be accompanying these chorale tunes, they actually reproved him, not for this particular piece, but for some of the other ones that he was doing. And they said, You have hitherto made many curious variations in the chorale, and mingled many strange tones in it, and for the fact that the congregation has been confused by it. And you can kind of imagine if you think about singing in a congregation in your place of worship and you're trying to sort of follow along with the melody, if you imagine trying to sing the melody while we heard all of that accompaniment going on in this piece, you can see that that was quite difficult. Now, what's interesting about this is that then there's a later letter where the employers say, you are playing too simply the accompaniment of these chorales. So Bach, I think, got a little angry. He said, well, you don't like these, wonderful kind of creative accompaniments that I'm making. They're too hard for you. I'm just going to do the simplest accompaniment possible. And then they got angry with him for doing that as well. So he certainly had a personality and had his opinions as well. So now I want to turn to this idea of Bach as a court musician. So he makes his living first as an organist. He's world renowned as an organist. He's asked to come and help repair organs and build organs, and he's really immersed in that world. But he then got this job at Köthen. All of his jobs, as you may know, are in Germany. He never actually left Germany, so they're all there. And here he was focused on writing secular music for a court and for a patron, Prince Leopold, who loved and supported his music. And this led to an incredible flowering of secular music. And here are a couple of the pieces that he wrote while he was in Köthen. First of all, he wrote a little book of piano pieces for Anna Magdalena Bach, and those are pieces that many of us have probably played if we were learning piano as a youngster. He wrote his Brandenburg concertos, which are some of the greatest concertos. He wrote inventions and symphonias for the keyboard, again, pretty typical to have if you're studying piano. He wrote the Well-Tempered Clavier for the keyboard instruments. We'll talk about that later. Partitas and sonatas for solo violin, suites for solo cello, and many, many more. So again, had he stayed at Köthen, he probably would have written secular music for the whole rest of his life. It was really what he was asked to do by his employer. So we're going to look a little bit at some of this secular music, and I'd like to turn first to the cello suites, which are some of the most beloved pieces by Bach. And a suite was a piece for instruments, and it consisted of a series of brief little movements. I like to think of movements kind of like chapters in a book. They have their beginning, middle, and end, but you haven't finished the whole book till you're through all of it. And most of them were based on a dance rhythm, like we might have a jig or a courant or a minuet. Now, people were not really dancing to this music. This wasn't written as dance music, but Bach certainly would have known these dances. He would have known these rhythms. And so he knew them when he was writing them, and he anticipated that people in his audience would know them as well. And he wrote six suites for unaccompanied cello, which is pretty hard because the cello typically only plays one note at a time. If you really work hard, you can play several notes at a time. We'll see that in a moment. But it is a big challenge for Bach to write these. And it's rare to highlight the cello as the soloist with no accompaniment. And each cello suite has six different movements, and they start with a prelude or kind of an overture, and then we move on into these dance movements, the allemande, the courant, the sarabande. Then that next to last movement will kind of vary, and then we'll get to the jig. So all of them have this pattern. So I think we might consider as we watch this why these pieces have just become such a staple of the repertoire. Anyone who plays the cello plays these suites at some point. anyone who plays an instrument that is in the same range as a cello, like a bassoon or a trombone or something like that, will play arrangements of these. And they're used a lot in commercials and movies. And we also hear them a lot at like civic occasions. Yo-Yo Ma, for example, a very famous cellist, has frequently played the solo cello suites when he's been asked to play for a memorial or for some kind of commemoration. So, what I want to do is watch as hmm, the PowerPoint doesn't like to move when it's in this arrangement. There it is. We're going to watch Mstislav Rostropovich playing on the cello, and we're going to look at a cello suite. And I would like to think a little bit again about why is it that so many people are drawn to these pieces? What do you personally like about them? So this is the jig. All right. So, and of course, everybody gets their own favorite performances. So you may have heard that piece at a different performance that you prefer. But for me, one of the things I love about that piece is just the sheer joy. I mean, Bach is not always considered a super emotional composer like maybe a Tchaikovsky might be, but this to me captures sheer joy. And yet, I think there are touches of sadness that give it depth. And I find this a lot in Bach's music, that it's very rare to have a piece that is all sad or all joyous. There's usually a little bit of the in between. And I think that speaks to us because that's typically our experience, right? We usually have a mix of emotions. This is definitely a challenge for the musician, and it's fun for the musician to play and to kind of challenge themselves to play it. It's fun for the listener to listen to and listen to different performances of it and compare those to each other. And there is a reward for meeting that challenge. Again, there are some pieces that are really, really hard and they kind of sound hard and they feel hard and they don't do a whole lot for you as a performer. But this is one that really rewards you for meeting the challenge. And I also think that sometimes when we talk about virtuosity, there are pieces that are just hard for the sake of being hard. And I think with Bach, it's difficult, but there's always sort of a musical aim. And I think the listener gets that there's more substance than just fluff. And here is cellist Pablo Casals, who is credited with reviving these pieces. They were known in the 19th century a little bit, but Pablo Casals was the cellist in the early 20th century who really put these on the map. And of Bach, he said, "This man who knows everything and feels everything cannot write one note, however unimportant it may appear, which is anything but transcendent. And I find this quotation really interesting because it does play on that idea of the worldly and the heavenly, right? This idea that this is a secular piece, it's not intended for the church, and yet somehow the music has almost this kind of spiritual uplifting quality. Now, another piece that was written while Bach was in Cöthen, or at least he wrote the first of two books of this in Cöthen, was called the Well-Tempered Clavier, and that's Bach's title page on the left. And the clavier, Well-Tempered Clavier, was a collection of 24 prelude and fugue sets. And these were for the clavier, which essentially meant any keyboard instrument. Now, I do want to note that even though I've mentioned a lot of us learned in our piano lessons when we're little, we learned some Bach, the piano had been invented during Bach's day, but it was very kind of rudimentary technology at that point, and Bach himself did not write for the piano. So he would have primarily written for the harpsichord or a variety of other types of keyboard instrument at the time. Now, each prelude and fugue is in one of the 24 major and minor keys. And if you've ever done any music, you know that we have this sense of, oh, we're in C major. So we start on the note C and we use the scale C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And we have our notes based on that. And then we can take any note on the keyboard, is often a good representation, and we can build a whole scale and key around that. So Bach will have Prelude and Fugue in C major, Prelude and Fugue in C minor, Prelude and Fugue in C sharp major, Prelude and Fugue in C sharp minor. And to a certain extent, this feels sort of normal to us today. Like, oh, okay, here's the piano, we've got all these notes, and we can play in all these keys. But actually, tuning, or tempering as it was called, was still fraught with problems. And not to get super technical here, but actually, if you take sort of the mathematical ratios of the distances between notes and you make them totally pure, you eventually get to the point where some notes sound good together, but others sound really terrible. And today we have a system known as equal temperament or equal tuning, where we make all of the notes kind of equally distant from each other in sound. And that allows us to write in every key. That system was actually not available widely during Bach's day, although that is a point of contention among scholars. And having Bach kind of come out with this really showed that he understood how to tune his keyboard instrument so that it could play in all of these keys. So it's one of those feats that kind of gets lost to history since it's not really a feat anymore. Bach did the entire Well-Tempered Clavier twice. Book one was from the very end of his Cöthen period, and then book two, another set of 24 preludes and fugues, was written in Leipzig. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to have a fugue. So a prelude probably feels pretty accessible term, the prelude, sort of an overture or beginning. But what is this thing called the fugue? Well, we want to look at this because Bach is extremely well known for writing something known as the fugue. He didn't invent the form, but it was something that he perfected, and that everybody else after him who ever wrote a fugue or a fugue-like section was definitely drawing on Bach. So what the fugue is, it is a piece of music that is based on one main melody. And in fugue terms, we call that the subject. And the subject is repeated throughout the piece, accompanied by this very dense texture of other melodies. So we typically will start the piece just with that subject, and then we'll kind of hear it almost like this thread in a tapestry, and we'll have all of these other melodies around it. But virtually all the material is derived from the subject in one way or another. So if we have a subject that starts with a rising line, then we might take that rising line and use it to build every melody that we hear in the piece. So the subject becomes this kind of, how shall I say it? It becomes sort of fodder for the entire piece. And it's a rather complicated form. It's difficult to compose because it's hard to write melodies that sound good by themselves and also together. And one thing I want to show you, we're going to look at a piece, a fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book One. And the video, as you may see, is one of a series of extremely clever videos where they've kind of made the music look visually. They've kind of given you a visualization of the music. And what I like about that is that every time the subject comes back, and we'll hear it by itself at the beginning, and then we'll hear it coming back, then we can kind of see visually as well as hearing that it comes back. And we can also see how all of these other lines and the different colors are kind of playing against that subject. So hopefully this will help. I think the visualization helps us understand how complicated the fugue is. So I hope you really enjoyed that. I love seeing that visualization. And one thing I like about this visualization too is that it kind of shows you, you may have noticed that whenever we had sort of the little kind of how shall I say it, the shaded part around the line, that was when we had the subject or the main melody. But sometimes it would be going down instead of up, and that was playing the melody kind of in a mirror image. Sometimes each of the notes would last longer than they usually did, so that was playing it kind of in something called augmentation. And so Bach was just playing all sorts of games and tricks with all the different melodies. It really was like a puzzle. If you're someone who likes puzzles, Bach is definitely for you. So why do we love this kind of piece? Um, First of all, we love it because Bach is the best at it. And Bach's son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, said through Bach's own study and reflection alone, he became, even in his youth, a pure and strong fugue writer. So he was somebody who, from the very beginning, was very good at doing what was quite a difficult task. So it really shows that he is a virtuosic composer. It is extremely difficult to write a fugue. You have to think of a melody that is going to work against other melodies. And with all the fun things that Bach is doing, think of a melody that sounds good upside down and sometimes backwards, and thinking of a melody that can go against itself and then can be played longer and shorter. The whole thing becomes kind of this game, and people just absolutely loved looking into that, especially composers. They loved studying Bach's fugues and still do. And so you can enjoy it on an intellectual level. And my students and I will always really enjoy, like, oh, I found this subject over there, or look, it's backwards. And it's really fun to look at that and enjoy it on kind of a mathematical level. But it's always a piece of music. I mean, that was really quite a beautiful piece. And so I think it's something often when I listen to these fugues, I'm not necessarily thinking about them in a mathematical structural way. I'm just being surrounded again, kind of like those organ pieces with this wash of all this different sound. So we're now moving to Bach's final phase of his life and one of the longest stretches of his career when he was the director of church music in Leipzig. And what this meant is that he was writing all of the music for the church services. He was playing or conducting all of the music for the church services. And he was also teaching the young boys who were singing in the choir and going to the school there. He was teaching them music and teaching them how to play. So if you have ever sung, for example, in the choir of your place of worship, or you've gone to a place of worship and you have a live musician there, think about if they had to not only sing that music or play that music, but if they had to write all of it. And if they had to write most of it for every single Sunday, something different, which is essentially what Bach had to do. He did recycle some of his music, but it was an extremely punishing compositional schedule. So I think in many ways we appreciate what a hard worker Bach was as well. So we are actually going to look at a little bit of the St. Matthew Passion, and we are actually in the perfect week for looking at this because it is for Holy Week. So a Lutheran Passion was a sacred work, and you would have all of the forces that you could muster at your church for this big event. You would have an orchestra, you would have a chorus, and you would have vocal soloists. And the Passion was a work that was performed for the Good Friday service. And in the Good Friday service, as churches still do today, we are telling the story of Christ's crucifixion according to one of the Gospels. So in this case, it's the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And Bach also wrote a St. John Passion that you may know. And we know that he wrote at least one of the other Gospels, but those two are lost if he did write those. Now, he wrote this for Good Friday in Leipzig in 1727, and then he did reuse it for several subsequent performances. It contains 68 different movements. So there might be a piece just for orchestra, a piece just for chorus. There might be one of those chorales. We do sing the chorales here. And then also we might have a piece for a vocal soloist. And it was scored for double the choir and double the orchestra. So again, it was really meant as a real testament and tribute to the importance that the Good Friday service has in the Lutheran Church and the liturgical year. And here is one of the best Bach scholars of today, Christoph Wolff, and his explanation of why this is such a great work. Its outsized formal dimensions and performance requirements, its compositional sophistication and technical mastery, and its powerful and poignant expressive qualities left behind all that had been customary or even conceivable in sacred music of the time. And I think that's another thing that we really do admire about Bach, and that I certainly admire, is that this was a fairly workaday job. His employers actually weren't that excited by him. They just wanted him to write music and kind of be quiet. They didn't want him to be asking for more forces or better instrumentalists. And so it wasn't really his dream job ultimately, but he didn't give up. He didn't just sort of phone it in. He really wrote beautiful, beautiful works. So he really held himself to an extremely high standard. And I think that's something that I certainly personally admire about him. And I think that's part of why people like him as well. So we're going to listen to a choir, and this is happening after Jesus has been captured and bound. And the chorus or the people there is sort of responding with horror. Has lightning, has thunder vanished in the clouds? Open your fiery abyss, O hell, smash, destroy, swallow up, dash to pieces with sudden fury, the false betrayer, the murderous blood. So this sort of intense feeling of horror at this act. And so we might think a little bit about what we like about this piece and also what it might be like to sing, because I do think that, for example, here at Baldwin Wallace University, we have every year a Bach festival. Our next one is coming up on April 17th and 18th. I hope you'll make the trek up if you're interested. And very often we will perform these huge works like the St. Matthew Passion. This year we're doing Bach's Magnificat and his Mass in G minor and some of his harpsichord concertos. But these are works that are kind of bringing the community together, and it's this festive atmosphere. And every year we're doing these big choral works. And part of it is because people just love to perform these as well as to hear them. So you might think a little bit as we're watching this, what might be fun about performing this. Okay, and then we go right on to the next piece. So why is it that we love something like this? And hopefully at this point you're starting to get a sense that we've listened to a lot of these pieces of kind of the Bach style, that kind of combination of really emotional and moving music, but also very complicated and kind of learned or scientific music as well. And I think that's that combination ultimately that people really love. Now, why do we love this particular piece? It's a little bit hard to capture from the video, but if you hear it live, just the sheer force of the sound. Even if we don't have that many performers, and Bach did not have 100-piece orchestras like we sometimes do today, but just the sheer force of that kind of choral sound. And that makes it fun to sing as well, right? If you're in the midst of that. Very fun to sing. It is difficult. Our students will sing in the Bach Festival, and they are often quite challenged by the work, but it's very gratifying to sing. I also think that these works tend to humanize the passion. To my mind, this piece sounds almost as extroverted as that toccata for organ that we listened to at the very beginning of the talk. But it's also a perfect expression for this portion of the sacred text. And choral conductor Robert Shaw, very famous choral conductor, had this to say. The thing that makes Bach's music last is not its intellectualization, but its consummate humanity and the fact that it is a simple human emotion, an extraordinary persistence and renaissance. And I really love this quotation because I think it does capture that idea of Bach. Very often people will think of him as very intellectual, somebody who's writing all these fugues and these complicated pieces. But I love this phrase, his consummate humanity, because I always keep coming back to Bach and kind of hearing those emotions and that kind of breadth of the human experience and the extraordinary persistence of Bach, continuing to write works no matter what he was asked to do and no matter what the circumstances of his life. And here we have a quotation from Bach as a good Lutheran. The aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. And I think this is a perfect way to end this idea of the worldly and the heavenly, where Bach is saying, everything that he's doing, regardless of whether it's sacred or secular, is to the glory of God. But it's also this idea of refreshing the soul. So enjoying life on earth, even as we look to life after death, right? So I hope this lecture has given you a sense of the variety and breadth of Bach's compositions. And we'll just and I think this is really a great way to understand why he's so great. Nobody again can ever say exactly why, but he's someone who has just persisted. Every composer, whether classical, whether jazz, whether pop, we see Bach in the concert hall, we see him in popular culture. And I think it's because of that incredible variety and force, emotional force of his music. So I am going to end my segment here, but I am very excited to hear your questions, your thoughts, your reactions, your reflections, what you like about Bach, or maybe even what you don't like about Bach. Not everybody does, but I think often you can find something that you love about him.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. Um, I we I don't see any questions yet, so people feel free to just submit your questions. And I have a number of questions myself to get us started until someone comes in, and I will give the audience questions priority. So as soon as we see something, I'll shift to the audience questions. But I was wondering something that strikes me with every example you played, and I've listened to some of Bach's music, like the Brandenburg concertos I listen to, frequently, and I love those cello suites. But there's a complexity to it. Like for example, you just play the Passion, and I find this complexity because he seems to be layering so many different contrasts. Like And again, I'm no music expert, so I don't know if I'm going to use the correct terminology, but he's in that passion. One thing that struck me was he's layering multiple rhythms, like a slow rhythm, a medium rhythm, a faster
Mhm.
rhythm, and maybe even a fourth faster rhythm. And it's that complexity that just sort of overwhelms the conscious mind, and you just have to let it wash over you. I was wondering if am I on the right track there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that
Yeah.
is ultimately what Bach is really known for is that what's sometimes called counterpoint, or the art of writing a melody, as you're saying, that then goes with another melody layered on top of it. And you described it beautifully. And sometimes it's also referred to as polyphonic music. And I think, to my mind, it's almost like a kaleidoscope where at any given point you can kind of listen to one voice or listen to another voice, or whatever it is. And I think that Bach is really showing that he is coming out of like the Renaissance choral tradition. If you've ever heard anything by like a Palestrina or a Josquin or some of the beautiful Renaissance church music, that is all about sort of one melody on top of the other. But I think what distinguishes Bach is that he does that, but then he also has this emotional force that comes out of it. It's never kind of a dry exercise. But yes, the mastery of counterpoint is definitely one of the things that people have pointed to as something that makes him great.
Wow. So we have a question here. Did Bach have to handwrite every part for every instrument slash vocalist?
Okay, that is a great question. And actually, one thing I will say, just putting in a plug for the Riemenschneider Bach Institute, which is a research library here at Baldwin Wallace, that our students work with that material. They do really amazing projects with it, and we have researchers from around the world come and work with our rare materials. And one thing we do have is we have a cantata or another church piece for choir that has all the different parts, or many of them, and some of those parts are either in J.S. Bach's hand or they are like corrected by his hand. And so it's pretty exciting. We actually have his handwriting here in Berea, Ohio. Now, did he actually do all of that? The answer is no. He did have copyists who were copying out the music. And very often, when Bach would have a student, like today we think of students and they live in their dorms and then they come and they take a class. But for Bach students, they actually lived in his home. And so they were boarding with him and they had tasks to do. And sometimes those tasks were to write out the music and write it in the different parts. And then also Bach's children and Bach's second wife, certainly Anna Magdalena Bach, she did quite a bit of copying. Sometimes that would be writing out the parts, and sometimes that would be taking a piece that he wrote, like the cello suites, and then rewriting it in kind of a fresh copy. And then, of course, even though we did have printed music started in the 16th century, but it still was not completely widespread. Like Bach did publish many of his works and they were available in printed copies, but people were just so used to doing everything by hand that a lot of his music just circulated in manuscript or handwritten copies. And so if somebody wanted one, they would kind of write out a new one and give it to them.
Oh, okay. We have another. Who who was Riemann Schneider?
Thank you so much for asking. So Albert Riemenschneider lived in kind of the very late 19th to 20th century. He passed away in 1950, I believe it was. And he actually started the Conservatory of Music at Baldwin Wallace, which is now the Conservatory of the Performing Arts. And he started that in the very early 20th century when he was in his 20s, if you could imagine. And Selma Riemenschneider, who was his wife, also taught at the conservatory. She was an accomplished vocalist. And Albert Riemenschneider himself was an organist, so he definitely loved Bach. And he also was a collector of music. He's one of those people who ran around to every music shop he could and bought music and wrote to booksellers around the world and bought music. And he was also a conductor. And he and Selma went to the Bethlehem Bach Festival in Pennsylvania, and they heard the Bach there and they said, we have to start a Bach festival in Berea, Ohio. And so they started it in the 1930s. And the Bach festival that we have is the oldest collegiate Bach festival in the US. And he did the conducting, and Selma, his wife, ran kind of the business side of it. And we have all sorts of programs and correspondence and scores that Riemenschneider annotated. He was a scholar. He actually edited a lot of those chorales that I talked about, who with those tunes from the Lutheran Church, the hymns. He edited a whole bunch of the Bach accompaniments to those. That's still a very famous edition. So he was sort of a musical powerhouse who loved Bach. And so he helped to found the Riemenschneider Bach Institute. It was his scores that he had collected over time that he donated and that became the core of that collection, even though we have scores from many, many composers now. And he started the Bach Festival and just was an amazing man. And
Oh, fantastic.
The Riemenschneider family is still really involved in Baldwin Wallace, and they come to the Bach Festival, and they're wonderful.
Wow. So we have two more questions here. I would like to know who Bach's influences were, or was he just inspired by God?
Well, he was definitely inspired by God. I mean, I think it's sometimes hard to put ourselves in the position of the people in Bach's time where just everything was about their faith, right? And that just pervaded their lives. But he did have a lot of influences. So I mentioned some of the Renaissance writers, like someone like Palestrina or Josquin. And there were other German writers. I would say we don't tend to know them as well, but someone called Schütz, Schu with a little umlaut, TZ, and then someone known as Buxtehude. Those were two German composers from a little bit earlier than Bach who were extremely good at writing choral music, especially in the case of Schütz. And then Buxtehude was an incredible organist as well. And so, like I said, Bach didn't invent something like the fugue. He wasn't the only one who wrote passions. Telemann, his contemporary, probably was more popular even than he was at the time. So he definitely sprang from other musicians. And then also, we're learning more and more about like how Bach was taught and how he taught other musicians. And they did have sort of stock kind of exercises that they would all do or chord progressions that they would all learn. But, as often happens, Bach was just really, really good at doing those, even though
Mm.
many people did them.
Someone asked, could you please tell us again what are the dates of the festival they say they've always wanted to attend?
Oh, I really hope you do come. So it's going to be on April 17th and 18th. On April 17th, the Remy Schneider Bach Institute will have an open house from 1 to 3. That's a Friday. And then we will have our student scholar, the Gott Scholar, presenting at 4 p.m. We'll have a concert in the evening. And then we have on Saturday a lecture at noon and an afternoon concert at 2, and then another evening concert. And maybe, I don't know, Michael, if you would be able to send out, but I certainly could give people a link to the website where you can get tickets and more information. And there's all sorts of things
Okay.
going on. They're like our brass students are playing in this tower, and it's a really
Mhm.
fun event. I really do hope that you come and stop by and introduce yourself.
Is that a weekend?
Yes, so Friday and Saturday.
Okay. Okay. Well, so it sounds like it attracts, I mean, it sounds like it's a really big thing. Does it attract people from around the country or?
It does. And
Wow.
actually, we certainly have a lot of community members come into that. And in some ways, it almost functions like an alumni event. A lot of
Mm.
people like to kind of come every year. And of course, our students are heavily involved and they come as well. So it's a fun event.
Well,
The performers are certainly from around the world.
wow, wow. I wanted to ask you, I only have a vague notion about this, and I want to see if this is true and if it might be a sign of Bach's greatness, right? Or how much his music is loved. But aren't a lot of his works transposed for other instruments?
Mhm.
Is that unusual for Bach? Is he unusual in that his work is often transposed? Like, for example, I don't know, the guitar, classical guitar or the lute
Mhm.
or that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I think there are some instruments, like I have a number of students who are saxophonists, and they don't have a whole lot of classical music written for them. So they tend to play a lot of transcriptions of many, many composers. But I
Hmm.
will say that Bach does seem to attract a lot of people who already have music written for their instrument, and they just want to play more of the Bach works. So, and I will also say that Bach and popular culture is quite pervasive. I mean, of course, we have a lot of that with someone like Beethoven, let's say, but the amount of Bach's music that has made its way into films and pop music, and we have a lot of jazz musicians who are really enamored with Bach and study him, and commercials. So it becomes really pervasive, and yeah, I would say he's right up there in terms
Wow,
of transcription, certainly.
wow. Um, I also wanted to ask you, when you were playing the um, cello suite, it, it, and again, I don't have a sense for this, right? So I'm asking you, really not knowing what I'm talking about or having no context, but I'm just wondering. It sounded to me that some of the notes, it was so fast. Could those have been 16th notes
Mhm.
that were being played that fast? Is that?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, if you are someone who reads music, you'll know that like a whole note will be pretty slow and like quarter notes will be kind of moderate, 16th notes, will be much faster. It
Yeah.
does sort of depend on how it's written and kind of the proportion, right? I mean, you could have all
Okay.
eighth notes and still play it really quickly. But yeah,
Yeah.
he definitely played that piece extremely fast. I can't really call the score to mind. I'm not a cellist, but certainly he was playing that very, very fast, I will say.
Well,
And another
well,
thing just to point out to everybody is that Bach's musical forces and his instruments were pretty different at his time. So, for example, I played the fugue with the piano, even though during his time it would have been played on a harpsichord. We had a video with a mixed gender choir singing, but it would have been boys singing the higher parts at the time. So we do have a lot. I mean, to get back to transcription, we have a lot of more modern versions of his music just to make it more accessible to modern performers.
well. I did. You mentioned you were talking about how his music is often played in film. There's a film actually that I enjoy. It's the Swedish director Ingmar Bergman.
Mhm.
His film Through a Glass Darkly.
Ah,
There are like three spots in the film. It's the only, there's no music, there's no score to that film. He just plays like three notes from one of the cello suites at key times in the film, you know. So you just hear like three notes and that's it. I thought that was
yeah.
interesting.
It is interesting. And actually, I edit the Bach journal that the Riemenschneider Institute puts out. And when I first started doing that in 2017, one of the things I did is I have a concert called Bach on Screen. And then those articles were published in the journal. And they were about everything from Bach in video music to Bach in films like Bergman's to Bach in commercials. And it was really exciting and interesting to hear all of that. And the very first piece I played, the organ toccata and fugue, I mean, I think that's used for every villain in the early 20th century film.
Yeah. Wow. Well, our time is up, so this was really wonderful. Really appreciate it. It's really fantastic.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. I'm sorry I can't see all of you, but I hope that you enjoyed it and certainly stay in touch. And I'm at Baldwin Wallace, so you can find my email and let me know if you have any questions or want to come to the festival.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.